Welcome to Retirement GPS, navigated by Zynergy, your roadmap to a secure and confident retirement. Each week, we explore strategies, stories, and planning frameworks designed to help you navigate the complexities of life after work. From tax planning to investments, income strategies to risk management, our goal is to give you the clarity and confidence you need to make informed decisions. But retirement isn't just about the numbers. It's also about lifestyle, purpose, and peace of mind. We're here to guide you through both the financial details and the personal dimensions of this next chapter. Let's chart today's course.
Welcome back to the Retirement GPS podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Zaharchek, certified financial planner and founder of Zynergy Retirement Planning.
And I am Zane Belsack, associate planner here at Zynergy. I was going to say it's great to see you all again, but it's great to talk to you all again.
Great to talk to you all again, exactly. Today we're answering the big question that we get a lot, which is, do I really need bonds in my portfolio? How do they work? What are they? And do they really make sense? Because they don't really seem to earn as much as stocks. We'll keep it simple. What are bonds? How do they pay you? Where do they fit? And what risks to watch? So I want to start this podcast like we start most of our podcasts. I want to talk a little bit about a couple named Maria and Ken. They came into our office and they were wondering the same thing. They own stocks and they had their bonds, but when you look at the portfolio at the end of the year, the bonds didn't perform much, whereas the stocks were up significant amounts. They were up in some cases 15%, 20%, and that was pretty distressing.
And can you blame them? A portfolio of bonds that are just constantly falling doesn't seem very assuring.
Sure, and if they were constantly falling, that would continue to certainly be a problem. But they're not necessarily falling, they just don't necessarily do anything, and that's really the challenge that Marie and Ken had. In fact, when they opened their Schwab account, which is where their investments were, and they looked at the total gains on the investments that they had in their portfolio over the last several years, the bonds were pretty much flat, really had no gains, whereas the stocks had upwards of 30, 40, 50% plus gains, depending on the fund that they were in, and that was really distressing for them. Of course, they were concerned, and they came in and they said, why are we investing in bonds? Why are we investing in treasuries? And what is the strategy here to invest in something that actually doesn't make any money? And it's a common misconception, and I want to give you the answer that we gave, but I want to go through in a lot more detail than we spent going through with Marie and Ken, is to understand why bonds are important in your portfolio, why they're shock absorbers, and why for anybody who's near or in retirement, they're a crucial key component to making sure that you have that properly diversified portfolio.
You said shock absorbers. I think of it like a car. It won't necessarily make you go faster, but when the road itself gets really rough, it helps keep the ride steady so you can really stay on course.
Absolutely. It allows us to sleep well at night, and there's a lot of reasons behind that. So let's dive into bonds and talk about Bonds 101. First of all, the purpose of a bond is not to grow in your account. We don't invest in a bond so that it grows over time. That's what stocks do. That's when we buy companies, right? When we buy a stock, we buy a company. One share of stock is one small percentage of a much larger company. That company is designed to grow. All companies are designed to grow. And that's what we expect out of our companies for the most part. With bonds, that's not what we expect. We expect bonds to pay income to us, right? We don't necessarily expect they're going to grow. We really should expect that they're going to pay us income. So a bond is a loan to either a government or a company. And what we're doing is we're taking our money and we're lending it to one of those entities with the understanding that they're going to pay us back in the future with interest. We get interest, which we call the coupon rate, and we get our principal back at maturity, someday in the future. So if I buy a bond 10 years down the line, I will get the money back that I invested or purchased that bond with, and then I'll get interest every year between now and the 10 years.
Is it just classified as a debt?
That's exactly it. Yep, it is a debt instrument, right? When we buy stocks, when we buy common stocks, when we buy a mutual fund that owns stocks, we're buying what we call equity, right? We're buying an equity stake in a company. If that company were to go bankrupt, we would lose all of our money because the equity would be worth zero. When we buy bonds, we're buying a debt. We are lending money to somebody at an interest rate that they're going to pay us back over time.
I keep thinking of it like a seesaw. It seems as one goes up, the other one goes down, and vice versa. One is for protection, whereas the other one is for accumulation.
Yeah, they actually do two very different things, and that's why diversification is so important in your portfolio. And we'll get to the seesaw effect in the future. But they really do accomplish two different things in our portfolio. One's designed to grow and to grow the portfolio. One's designed to stabilize and provide income to the portfolio. The three basic components of a bond is the face value. So what is the face value of that bond? It may be $10,000, it may be $1,000. Most bonds are in $1,000 increments. There's also a coupon rate. So what is the interest I'm going to get? We're going to try to use pretty easy numbers in this podcast so that everybody can understand bonds. But if it's $1,000 face value and the coupon rate is 5%, then we know that every year on $1,000, we're going to get $50 in interest every single year. And then the maturity date. When am I getting my $1,000 back? Right? So if I lend them $1,000, I'm getting $50 a year. When am I going to get that $1,000 back over time? We are less concerned about growth. In fact, when we invest in bonds, we really shouldn't expect any growth. That is what troubles some of our members because they look at the other investments and they see this growth, and bonds effectively have no growth. And I say effectively, and we'll talk about why, but there is change to the pricing of bonds, which may look like growth or it may look like decline in value, but it's not. It's just simply the change in the principal value. Because that's not how we make money. We don't necessarily make money from the price swings of bonds. We make money from interest income. We know that our bond is going to pay us our interest, and that's our income. And we can take that income and we can then either use it to live off of, or we can reinvest it back into the portfolio or back into the bonds to make sure that we're continuing to reinvest and thus potentially growing our portfolio. But our portfolio growth doesn't come from price appreciation. It comes from income. Does that make sense?
It does. And a quick question, do all bonds have a face value, coupon rate, and maturity date, or are they different in any way?
All bonds will have a face value. All bonds will have a maturity date, but not all bonds will have a coupon rate. And what I mean by that is some bonds don't pay coupons. Those are called zero coupon bonds. So there's maybe bonds that we give them a chunk of money today. If I'm buying a $1,000 bond, I'm going to give them $960 today. And a year from now, I'm going to get $1,000. We call that a zero coupon bond. Your Series EE bonds, those are the bonds that you may remember you got as a kid from grandma and grandpa. They went to the bank or on Treasury Direct, purchased a bond for $25. It matured to $50 at a certain time, but it didn't actually pay a coupon. It didn't actually pay interest. It just matures to face value in the future. So the next way that we can make money in bonds is through price movements, right? So bonds can actually go up and down. And effectively, a bond is not designed to go up and down, but it does in the marketplace. And let me explain what I mean by that. If I purchase a 10-year treasury bond and I spend $1,000 and it's a 5% coupon, so I'm going to get $50 every single year for the next 10 years, and at year 10 I get my $1,000 back plus my $50 in interest. We're lending money to the government, and now we got to hold that bond for 10 years till it reaches maturity to get our money back. But what happens if during that time we need to sell that bond? We need to take it to the marketplace, sell it to somebody else who would buy it from us. We would sell it at a certain price, right? We would want to get a certain amount of money back. Now, if we did that 5 years from the date we bought it, there's still 5 years left on that bond. What happens if interest rates in the environment change? So we purchased a 10-year bond at 5% interest. What if rates went up? Right, so now in the marketplace, I could go and buy a 10-year bond or a 5-year bond for 7% or 8% interest. Now, my lowly little bond here earning 5% doesn't look quite as good to the marketplace, right? Because I can go and buy a bond for 7 or 8%.
Yeah, at that point, I would just take advantage of the market.
Right. If I'm the buyer, I wouldn't really want to buy your bond. I'd want to just go buy in the open market and get something for 7, 8%. You're 100% right. What that means for me as the seller is I've got to change the principal value, the face value of the bond so that I can sell it at a 7 or 8% coupon. And what does that mean? My face value of my bond is not going to be worth $10,000 anymore. Now it might be worth $9,600. So that the yield to maturity is now 7 or 8%. We'll just say 7%. So now I can go into the marketplace and there are buyers that will want to buy my bond because they're only going to pay $960 for a $1,000 bond that will mature in 5 years, and they're going to get 7% interest, which is market. So what happened to my bond? It actually went down in value. Why did it go down in value? Because interest rates in the marketplace went up. So there is an inverse relationship to bonds and interest rates. If I own a bond and rates go up, I'll lose money on that bond. If I own a bond and rates go down, my bond will appreciate, go up in value. Okay, why? For the same reason. If I have a 5% bond and the market's paying 3%, boy, my bond looks like a superstar now, right? Why would I want to sell that bond ever to somebody at 5% when in the open market the interest rates are 3%? I want to hold that bond forever. But if I need the cash today, I can go and sell it and probably sell it for more $1,040, $1,050. So that yield to maturity equals close to the market, about 3% today.
And what about the interest? What would you really do with the interest when it ends up coming into your bond?
That's a great question. I have a 10-year treasury and I'm getting $50 in interest every single year. The answer is I can do whatever I want with that interest. It's my money, right? So in a lot of cases, people live off that interest. In a lot of cases, people reinvest that interest. What we do in our portfolios, and we'll talk about this a little bit more sophistication down the line, but we take all the income, if people aren't using their income, we take all the income, let it get dumped into the portfolio. So that'll be interest from bonds, that'll be dividends from stocks, and we'll let all that money just accumulate till it reaches a certain threshold. And when that threshold's hit, we go in and we invest it into the portfolio. But what we do is we don't take the bond interest and reinvest it into more bonds, right? Because maybe we don't want to buy more bonds. Maybe bonds are doing really well and becoming a larger part of our portfolio. Maybe stocks are doing really poorly and stocks are a better investment now than bonds. So we want to take that cash and we want to invest it in the part of the portfolio that is doing the worst, which actually is becoming a lower and lower percentage of the portfolio than we originally intended. So if stocks are falling, we all have heard the adage, if stocks fall, they're on sale, right? It's like buying canned soup at Walmart when it's 50% off. When stocks are falling, we want to be reinvesting more into stocks and using that cash to reinvest into stocks. When stocks are rising and hitting all-time highs and bonds are falling, we want to be buying more bonds. So we'll take the coupon and basically reinvest it. But the short answer is that really is up to the investor. They do whatever they want with that money. They can buy more bonds, they can take a vacation, they can reinvest it into stocks or anything else that they feel is appropriate. So the price moves up and down of bonds can be deceiving because a lot of people will see that, say, interest rates have risen and bonds have fallen, and now I'm losing money in my bonds. Let's get rid of these things, right? These are terrible things to have. Let's get rid of them. No, that's not how that works in a diversified portfolio. Just because something has fallen in the short term doesn't mean we want to get rid of it. And it simply is a price swing because of the interest rate moves. Now, it's really important to understand, too, the longer the duration, meaning how long am I expected to own this bond, the more volatile the interest rate will affect the bond price. So if I own a bond that matures in a year, if interest rates move 1%, I'll probably have very little to no effect on my bond price. But if my bond matures in 10 years or 30 years and interest rates move 1%, now I'm going to have a big move in my bond price because whoever I would ultimately sell that bond to, they've got to hold it for a really long time at a really low rate. The duration is in direct proportion to the move in the bond price if interest rates move.
And you mentioned the Series EE bonds. What other types of bonds are there to offer? I know that there's government bonds, there's different corporate bonds, there are bond funds. If you could dive deeper into that for the audience, that would be great.
There are a lot of different types of bonds. First are U.S. Treasury bonds. U.S. Treasury bonds represent the biggest market in the world, including the stock market. They're bigger than the stock market. There's more money invested in treasuries than there are in U.S. stocks, which is pretty incredible if you think about that. The U.S. Treasury market makes up the debt that is issued by the federal government of the United States of America. And these could be things like really short-term, safe T-bills. T-bills can be as short as 6 months, 3 months. Actually, 3 months is the shortest duration on a T-bill. Those are zero coupon bonds. I might pay something like $991 for a $1,000 T-bill, and in 3 months, I get my $1,000. And that's typically how a T-bill works. There's notes, which are midterm. Those run anywhere from 1 to 5 years. So treasury notes. And then we have treasury bonds, which are long-term. Those are over 5 years. So those are your 10 years, your 20-year, your 30-year bonds. Then we have TIPS, which are issued by the federal government as well. They stand for Treasury Inflation Protected Securities. What is great about TIPS, if you are concerned about inflation, you're concerned about rising prices, bonds can be a problem in that sense, right? If I buy a 10-year treasury and I spend $1,000 and at 5% I'm getting $50 a year, guess what happens over time? Inflation running at 3%, I'm losing purchasing power over time on my $50. My $50 is not changing. I'm getting $50 every year in year 1, in year 5, in year 7, in year 9, and so on. If inflation is going up, it means my purchasing power is going down over time. That $50 is worth less and less with each subsequent year. So Treasury inflation protected securities protects against that. There's an interest rate component, and then there's an inflation component that adjusts every 6 months to keep up with inflation. So if inflation is high, you're going to get more interest from your tips.
Speaking of protection, you would say that these two types of bonds are really the safest ones out there. Are they backed by the U.S. government? So how safe can that really get? That's essentially risk-free, isn't it?
And in our society, we call that risk-free in the world of finance. What we mean by that is the federal government has the keys to the printing press. So if they can't pay their obligations, their liabilities, they just print more money and they pay it. We trust the federal government such that they represent the dollars in our pockets. They are as safe as it comes because they do have the keys to the printing press. If our government were to collapse, then the dollars in your pockets would be worth nothing. Your stocks would be worth nothing, and so would your bonds. We're probably not so much worried about our 401ks at that point. We're probably all heading to the hills and looking for our shotguns and finding that cabin so that we can wait it out.
I was going to say, at that point, what really matters?
Yeah, that's zombie apocalypse time, right? It's like when somebody says, what happens if there's nuclear war? I say, your 401k is not your biggest problem at that point. We basically are dealing with situations that are so bad, the entire way we frame the world has changed. So we don't really have to worry about our money at that point. So treasuries and tips in a functioning democratic capitalist society are the safest we're going to get. The next few options are a little bit less safe for sure. So we have what's called agency bonds. This is Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac. These are government-backed bonds. You also can see Ginnie Mae bonds out there as well. And basically they're bonds that support mortgages. And they're government-backed as well, so they're also very safe. They can have other challenges to them because what happens when interest rates go down? If we own a bond and interest rates go down, we love that, right? Because we make money on our bonds, as we talked about. But with Freddie and Fannie and Ginnie Mae, a lot of people have a mortgage and the interest rates go down. What do? They refinance that mortgage, right? So they pay off that bond with money from another loan at a lower rate. In a Ginnie Mae, Freddie Mac, with agency bonds, especially government mortgage-backed securities, there's a lot of refinancing that goes on when interest rates fall. And that's a risk because you're not really benefiting from falling interest rates like you would in the other bonds. The other option is municipal bonds. Municipal bonds are great. We get a lot of questions about municipal bonds here. They're typically issued by state and local governments, municipalities, and what they're looking to do is to borrow money to either support general government operations or to support a project. So there's two types of municipal bonds, and it's really important to understand the two different types. First one is called the general obligation bond, which means if the state of New Jersey issues bonds, those bonds are backed by the full taxing authority of the state of New Jersey. That means if New Jersey's got to go out there and can tax to raise money to make sure that those bonds are paid. Those are the safest municipal bonds. There's also revenue bonds. So if the state of New Jersey wants to build an airport, right, to compete with Newark or on the south side of New Jersey, they might borrow money to build that airport, and those revenue bonds are tied to the revenue that comes from that airport. So if the airport is successful, you'll get your money back. If it's not successful, you risk default because it's not a general obligation bond to the state of New Jersey. And of course, because there's more risk to a revenue bond, you're going to get a higher interest rate. People get very excited about municipal bonds that are revenue bonds because they see 7, 8, 9% rates, not understanding that it's tied to a project that could fail. And if the project fails, you don't get your money back.
It's not typically risk-free per se. It's very rare in our history, but correct me if I'm wrong, I think states have declared bankruptcy.
Yeah, actual states haven't declared bankruptcy, but cities have. So the city of Detroit in 2008 declared bankruptcy. States have gotten close to needing to declare bankruptcy, and the federal government has stepped in to prop them up. Not a guarantee, and that's not something that we can expect, but that has happened in the past. But yes, higher risk when you invest with a state or municipality versus the federal government because, once again, state does not have the keys to the federal printing press. They cannot print money. If they don't have enough money, if their financial situation is a mess, they have to do something like raise taxes. And that creates other problems, right? You have very high taxes in a state that is cutting programs. People move out of that state. Now you have a lower tax base. You've got to raise taxes even more. It becomes a vicious cycle. Municipalities are certainly more risky than the U.S. government, but they do have one pretty significant benefit is if you invest in municipal bonds, that interest on those municipal bonds is federal tax free. So you don't pay any federal income tax on the interest from your New Jersey state or New York state or California state bonds. They're also typically state tax free if you buy municipal bonds in the state you live in. So if you live in New Jersey and buy New Jersey municipal bonds, you're not going to pay federal or state income tax on the interest on those bonds. That's obviously really valuable as well, and people get really excited about that. But it's typically reflected in the interest rate. So being able to calculate the interest rate against the tax liability of the individual is really important. During years where income tax brackets are very high, taxes are very expensive, then municipal bonds are a fantastic investment strategy. We're in a period now in 2025 where taxes are historically relatively low, so it makes municipal bonds a little bit less beneficial to the average investor. Next, we have corporate bonds. Corporate bonds, like municipal bonds, they're not issued by a government, they're actually issued by a corporation, as the title says. Certainly higher risk, also higher yield, so higher return. You have a company like Apple that's got, how much money does Apple have in reserve? Something like $250 billion or something.
I was just going to say a lot.
Yeah.
That's the answer.
It's $250 billion that they have sitting around. If they issue bonds, and they do, you say, well, why does a company with $250 billion sitting around issue bonds? Because a lot of that money is sitting overseas. They don't want to bring it over and pay tax on it. So they issue bonds in America because they have money sitting in Ireland or sitting in England. Understandable. It's just financial engineering. So they'll issue a bond, very safe, very comfortable. If you buy a bond from Apple, you're not going to get a much better interest rate than if you were to get it from the U.S. Treasury. It'd be slightly better, but not a whole lot better. Then you have things we call high yield or junk bonds. You probably heard the old junk bond term from the 80s. It was a big thing in the 80s where people were buying junk bonds. Junk bonds are basically low quality companies that have high risk but are paying a high interest rate, 11, 12, 13% interest during a period where the federal government may be paying 4%, but there's also a high risk you're not getting your money back. So we want to be careful of that risk. We want to make sure that if we're investing in something, but there's a chance I'm not getting my money back, that can be pretty devastating, especially if it's supposed to be in the quote-unquote secure part of my portfolio.
So these are more so the penny stocks. I guess as stocks have penny stocks, these are like penny stocks just for bonds.
Yeah, it's really good analogy, a pretty good example. Stocks have penny stocks, which are high risk and also high return. Same thing with junk bonds. And the adage in the 80s, which is why you heard a lot about junk bonds in the 80s and there were a lot of junk bond brokers, is because they felt like they could diversify away the risk, right? They said, if I buy 100 different junk bonds and put them in a junk bond portfolio or ETF, and they were all paying 11 to 13%, yes, some would default, but the majority would hang around and I would make a lot of money. And that worked for a while until we went through a recession, and it actually blew up that strategy completely, which recessions and depressions tend to blow up those types of strategies.
And these corporate bonds, aren't they used to fund projects? I know Tesla is always making new bonds for new trips, new things to build. Isn't that the way that corporate bonds work as well?
Absolutely, and that's what corporate bonds are designed for, because not to get too detailed into how companies operate and work, but there's a lot of ways to finance company growth or projects. You could issue equity, or you can do it through debt, or you can do what's called bootstrapping, which is just save money and use your profits to pay. But for companies that are growing aggressively, typically they want to issue either equity or debt so that the company has enough money to grow. So that's why these corporations issue these bonds. These are really the types of bonds that you're going to be dealing with on an ongoing basis. There is something that Zane was talking about, which is called a bond fund, a bond mutual fund, or a bond ETF. All that is really taking one of these types of bonds, grouping them together, and putting them into a collection to create a fund. So if I take the U.S. Treasuries bonds and all kinds of durations, anything from a year to 10 years, and I put all these different bonds into a fund. So now there's 500 bonds with durations of 1 year to 10 years in one fund. Now I have what's called diversification, right? I have broad diversification, not necessarily in the risk, because we know the treasuries don't really have a lot of risk or any risk per se. They don't have risk of default. It's more the duration risk, right? Now I'm less concerned if I have a 10-year bond, and we talked about this, if interest rates go up, I'm going to lose a lot of money in that 10-year bond. But if I have a 1-year bond and a 10-year bond and a 3-year bond and a 2-year bond and a 7-year bond, we're not as concerned about duration risk, because the duration risk averages out to be a lot shorter. Bond funds are really helpful to diversify out our duration risk. Speaking of risk, let's talk about risks and the various risks that you can expect in your bonds. There is nothing in this world that is risk-free. And it's interesting because a lot of times we as financial planners toss around this term risk-free, loosey-goosey. Oh, an annuity is risk-free, or oh, a bond is risk-free. There is risk associated with everything. There's different types of risks. Me not getting out of bed in the morning because I'm afraid of risk is accepting a risk, right? Lying in bed all day is accepting a risk. So we're accepting one risk to try to solve for another in every single case, every single investment that we have. Another good example is if I were to take my money and bury it in the backyard in a jar, right? Because I'm afraid of risk with my money. I'm accepting a risk. What are the risks I'm accepting? Zane, if I take my money, put it in a glass jar, bury it in the backyard because I'm afraid of the economy or the stock market or anything, what risks am I accepting with burying that money in the backyard?
That's a good question. And this is actually a problem that we see, and I think we've talked about it in most of our episodes. But so say you were to put $10 in a jar and bury it in your backyard. In 10 years, you get back to that $10 and it's still worth $10. It hasn't grown.
The cost of things in the world around us have increased, but our $10 hasn't changed. So the $10 not changing, a bottle of Coke may have cost $1, and now 10 years later it costs $2. So my $10 actually purchases only 5 bottles of Coke instead of 10 when I first buried it. So there's risk, right? The other thing is, what if I forget where I buried it? Right?
That's a good question, yeah.
Yep, so the fact that we could lose that money, right? Or what if somebody stole it? What if somebody saw me burying it and then went in the backyard and dug it up in the middle of the night and stole it?
Someone found my map.
Yeah, exactly.
My treasure map.
My treasure map, that's right. The pirates' risk diversification strategy back in the day. So there's risk to every single thing that we do, and we just rattled off 3 risks by taking money and burying it in your backyard. Let's talk about the risks when we invest, specifically when we invest in bonds. First one is, of course, we talked about it, interest rate risk. Right, we locked in for a pretty long duration, 5-10 years at an interest rate of whatever percent, 5%, and interest rates go up. So with interest rates going up, we're going to have risk that we're going to lose principal. Now we can hang on to that bond for the entire 10 years, and you might say, there's no risk, I'll just hang on to it for 10 years. That's great. You're going to underperform the rest of the market for 10 years because you're going to get a 5% interest when the market is paying 7 or 8%. So there is risk. It's opportunity risk in that case. But typically we're worried about interest rate risk, right? Credit risk. So the good thing is with treasuries, we can avoid this risk, which is the person I'm lending money to going to pay me back. We are talking about the U.S. government when it comes to treasuries, but what if I'm simply lending money to my brother, right? And I'm lending my brother $5,000 and he's paying me a 3% interest rate. There is credit risk. My brother may not pay me back because that's just what my brother does. And by the way, this is not my brother, but we all have heard the horror stories, right? Lending money to family. So credit risk is something that we would be concerned about is, will I get my principal back? And when we're investing in corporate bonds or municipal bonds, this is certainly a problem. Next is inflation risk. We talked about that. What if we're assuming a 2 or 3% inflation? We lend our money out at 5% over time, and inflation spikes up to 7 or 8%. What happens to that 5% interest? My guess is you can do some simple math. If I'm getting 5% but costs are going up at 8%, I'm losing purchasing power every single year, even though I'm getting $50 back. Because costs are going up by $90 on my $1,000. Inflation risk is a big one. Call risk, not one that most people talk about. Call risk is if I issue a bond, it's callable, which means the lender has the right to actually pay the bond off, which was something we talked about with Ginnie Mae and Freddie Mac. Mortgages are callable notes. We know that. We can refinance a mortgage whenever we want. If I have a bond that's 10 years and I locked in at 8%, and I'm like, wow, this is great, and rates keep falling and falling, and now they're down at 3%, and I'm like, look at me, I'm a superstar, I made all this money, and then all of a sudden the bond gets called away from me because the lender pays it off. Typically in that case, the lender's refinancing it, but they may just say, hey, we've got the cash now, we don't want to pay 8% on our money, we're going to pay it off. So call risk is a big one because the things worked out exactly the way we wanted them to. We bought a bond, we locked in at a high rate, interest rates fell, but now they get called away from us. A lot of corporate bonds are callable, so be sensitive to that. And of course, mortgage bonds or mortgage-backed securities are callable as well.
It's a good problem to have, but obviously nothing in life is perfect and free.
Of course, and again, lots of good problems out there. It's saying we invest in a stock, let's say NVIDIA, and it does exactly what we want it to. It goes up and up and up, but we only can make 5% on it, and it went up 100%, so it gets called away from us because we could only make 5%. We need to understand those risks, even the risks of good things happening. And then the last one is liquidity risk, which is some bonds, especially if we're buying some junk bonds or small liquidity type corporate bonds that actually not a lot of people trade in. For treasuries, it's not much of a problem. But if I need to liquidate my bond in the future before it matures, is there a market out there for it? And in a lot of cases with a lot of bonds, there isn't, which means you're going to pay a pretty big spread in order to liquidate that bond, because a broker has to go out and find a buyer for that bond, and the buyer is going to want to make money immediately on the trade. So that can be a problem. You may not be able to sell your bond at all because there's just no buyers out there for that type of bond. So liquidity risk is important.
A good question to ask is, why exactly would you need bonds, or how much bonds should you have in your portfolio?
The reason why we want to have bonds in our portfolio is for diversification purposes. And I know that's a buzzword. A lot of people say diversification. What is diversification? Why do I need it? We're not going to spend a lot of time on diversification. In fact, we'll probably do an entire podcast in the future on diversification and the importance of it. But it's important to understand bonds, to understand their role in diversification, to understand how they work. Specifically, interest rates falling, bond values going up, and vice versa. It's why in our portfolios we like to have bond funds and not actual bonds, because bond funds tend to fluctuate a bit more than actual bonds because they are diversified naturally. And we like to have bonds in our portfolio. Number one, because for someone near or in retirement, income is a crucial component. Having a guaranteed income source that we know is going to be paying into our portfolio is fantastic, in good times and in bad. The other reason that we like to have it is bonds act as stabilizers. Again, bonds don't move as much as stocks. We know that. Even long-dated bonds that are 30 years, 20 years, that have a lot of volatility, they're still not going to be quite as volatile as stocks. They might be pretty volatile relative to bonds. You might have a 10% swing, but you're not looking at 30, 40, 50% swings generally, unless there's a really unique situation going on. But what they do is they tend to act counter to bonds. So Zane talked about it earlier. He talked about the seesaw effect. So bonds tend to go down when stocks go up, and when stocks go down, bonds tend to go up. And what that does is that provides us what we call diversification. It's not a perfect negative correlation, right? We're always looking for low to negative correlation. A negative correlation of 1.0 means that if stocks fell 10%, bonds rose 10%. Every single time. That's not the case with bonds. It doesn't always work 100% of the time. But typically what happens is when stocks start to fall, they typically fall because we're in a rough economy, a challenging economy. And generally, with few exceptions, when we're in a tough, challenging economy, interest rates fall. Why do they fall? Because the Fed comes out, they start cutting rates, they want to provide liquidity into a system that's really challenging or really going through a tough time. If you look at the 2008-2009 financial crisis, stocks were falling, economy was getting very soft, and the Fed came out and just started cutting rates aggressively. So if I had bonds in the middle of 2007, I was getting about a 6% interest rate. By the end of 2009, the interest rates in the market were about 1.5%. So my 6% bonds looked like superstars. So I made a lot of money on my bonds if I were holding bonds during that really tough time while the stock market was falling. And in fact, what we were doing was we were using the profits from those bonds and we were selling them off to purchase stocks at cheaper prices, right? So the seesaw effect allows us to sell some bonds that are doing well during a bad time to buy stocks that are having a really tough time. And the reverse is true. When stocks are doing really well, which stocks do well most of the time, bonds can either do nothing or can do poorly because interest rates may go up, which means I may be losing money in my bonds. And what that allows us to do is sell some of our stocks that are making money and reinvest and buy more bonds, but we're getting a higher coupon even though in the short term they've been losing money. We're getting a higher interest rate. So as interest rates go up, we're buying new bonds at higher rates, which gives us more diversification so that when things switch, and they inevitably do, stocks will fall at some point, we now have higher interest rate bonds that we can sell off to buy stocks at cheaper prices. That's what diversification is. It's the up and down.
I don't know why. I always like to think of everything, I guess, in finance as buckets. It all seems to connect back to buckets. But as your stocks overflow, you like to take a little bit of water in your stock bucket and pour it into your bond bucket and vice versa.
Yeah, that's a good analogy and very true. We always want to make sure that we have the appropriate amount in each of the buckets, and it provides a stability, especially once you do hit retirement and you start drawing from these accounts. Having bonds provides a fair amount of safety to know that if we're going through a COVID correction or a 2008-9 correction, again, COVID is probably a bad example because that was a wicked, difficult correction over a very short period of time, but recovered also very quickly. 2008, 2009, there was a very slow recovery. It took about 2 years for the market to fall, and then about another 2 to 3 years to get back to all-time highs. So you're talking about a 5-year turnaround, which is a long time if you're drawing income. Having bonds to stabilize those movements and provide the income will really help your performance over time. So yeah, it's really frustrating when the market's having a great year and you look at your bonds and you're like, say, wow, they're not really doing much at all. But we wouldn't do it any other way, because when bad times come, they will be your best friend.
Something to consider is how much exactly should you have in stocks and how much should you have in bonds. Now, I've seen a lot of different rules online or words of advice, like the rule of 100. I've even heard of the rule of 110. And basically the rule of 100 is basically the stock allocation is 100 minus your age. And Ryan, I'm just wondering, what are your opinions on the rule of 100? Because I know at Zenergy, everything is specified towards the individual.
I generally don't like rules of thumb in financial planning. I think they lead people astray. They may appeal to a broad swath of people, but they're typically wrong for each individual when you break it down. The rule of 100, as Zane said, means if you take your age and subtract it from 100, that's how much you should have in stocks. So if I'm 50 and I take my age of 50 and subtract it from 100, I should be 50% stocks and 50% bonds. My opinion is that's way too conservative for a 50-year-old to be 50% stocks and 50% bonds. I don't really like the rule of 100. I don't like that rule of thumb in general, because we look at what your portfolio allocation should be based on really 3 main things, which number 1 is what is your risk tolerance, right? What is your tolerance for risk, your volatility along the way? Number 2, what is your goal? What is your objective? What are we trying to accomplish? And then number 3, what is the time horizon to accomplish that goal? And these things all play together. Sometimes we have a 25-year-old that'll come and talk to us and say, no, I'm really conservative. I want to be in all bonds or all cash because I don't like the stock market volatility. And our job here at Zenergy is to talk that person into being more aggressive, because if they're putting money away in a retirement account, we want them to understand that volatility is a part of it, but they should not be worked up about volatility in the short term because they have a long time horizon. Their goal is to have enough money in retirement. And yes, their risk tolerance may say, I have a low risk tolerance and I want to be comfortable, but you're not accomplishing your goal and you're investing poorly based on your time horizon because you have a lot of time. So we definitely should be more aggressive. The same is true of a 70-year-old, and I have 70-year-olds walk into our office all the time that say, I'm really conservative, and they have their entire portfolio in 2 tech stocks. And we'll say to them,
we have seen that, yeah. I want everything in Bitcoin.
Yeah. And we'll see that, and it's very difficult to explain to them that their quote-unquote conservative portfolio is one of the most aggressive portfolios I've ever seen. But they say, no, but it's doing well. Yeah, it is doing well, and that's fine, but you have 2 individual tech stocks that make up the entirety of your portfolio. That's extraordinarily risky.
My question is, what happens when it doesn't?
Yeah,
what are you going to do when it doesn't?
That's a great point. And what do you do when it doesn't? And I know what they do. They sell. They wind up selling when it's way too low. That's exactly what happens. So what we do is we'll talk to that 7-year-old and talk to them about a diversified portfolio and the percentage of bonds that they should have. So there is really no one right answer. At Zenergy here, we go anywhere from 0 bonds in a portfolio. We have people as young as teenagers that have IRAs with us because their parents were adamant. They set up a Roth IRA with us, and they have 100% stocks, and they should be 100% stocks because they're going to continue to contribute. It's not a lot of money, and dollar cost averaging will really benefit them. So they want volatility in that portfolio, all the way up to 50 and even 60% bonds in a portfolio. We tend not to go too much above 50% bonds in a portfolio. 50-50 is a nice conservative portfolio. The only reason we would be more than 50% bonds is if somebody really needs the money soon. They're going to buy a house and they want to buy a house within the next 2 years, or they're in their 90s and they know that this is money that they need to live off of the next 2-3 years. In fact, in that case, we probably don't even want bonds. We want very safe cash components like T-bills or money market, that type of thing where we know there's no volatility.
I think it really emphasizes the different types of allocations for different types of individuals. Everyone has different situations, and an 80-year-old might be as aggressive as a 60-year-old should be, and vice versa. A 50-year-old might be as conservative as an 80-year-old should be according to this rule of 100. It really depends on your situation.
Really what it comes down to is our job is to educate them. Our job is to sit down with them, figure out what they're trying to accomplish. What are their goals? What is their risk tolerance? And a lot of times their risk tolerance is wrong. And I hate to say that because it's saying your feelings are wrong, but it can be solved just with some good education and telling people, yeah, you might be conservative and you want to be a little more more and more conservative, but you're young, you've got time. We recommend being more aggressive and just not looking at it. If you don't look at it, you don't really get worried about it or worked up at it. Just avoid it effectively. Don't look at your statements or your performance. We'll look at it once a year or even less so that you don't get stressed out about it. And the opposite's true. If somebody is 75 years old and has all of their money invested in 2 tech stocks, I'm sorry, but they're wrong. That is definitely a wrong investment strategy for them unless it's $5,000 and the money doesn't really matter to them. That's not the case of what we're talking about. We're talking about somebody who had basically their entire life savings. So that is wrong. I don't care what your risk tolerance is. We need to educate you on how to do that properly. So we do think there's some education to risk tolerance. And a lot of times it's just nuance, just shifting the way you're thinking about risk here or there to know that if we invest properly, you'll never lose all of your money. The very, very low probability of losing all of your money. Again, we're talking nuclear holocaust time. Literally, what would it cost to take for the S&P 500, 500 of the biggest companies in the world to go out of business? What would it take for that to happen, Zane? What could you imagine?
At that point, would there even be a United States? It would have to all fall apart.
Correct. If every company in the S&P 500 was gone, I don't think your 401k is your biggest concern. I think, again, we're heading to the hills into a cabin with our shotguns. When you understand how risk really is framed, it helps you get comfortable with your risk tolerance. But we're not here to talk about risk tolerance. We're here to talk about bonds. So let's kind of wrap up here and talk about our action steps. First, decide where you stand. What is your age? What is your risk tolerance? What are your goals? If you are approaching retirement and have no bonds in your portfolio, you need to seriously think about that. I don't like the 100 rule. Don't use that as your guidepost, but think about what percentage is right for you. Even adding 20% bonds to your portfolio if you're 60 is going to dramatically reduce the volatility and risk in your portfolio. Think about what is the right framework for you. We use bond ETFs. Think about what is the right bond vehicle for you. Do you want to buy an individual bond? If not, go ahead and go buy a bond fund. There's some great bond funds out there, but look for a safe bond fund. We don't want the safe component of our investment portfolio to be at risk, especially high risk, because we're reaching for a couple extra percentage points of return. That is a mistake. We want our safe component to be safe. Look for treasuries, look for high quality corporate bonds. Apple is safe. We're comfortable that Apple's got enough cash that they're going to pay their debts. So those are the types of bonds that we're looking for. Then make sure that you're rebalancing. So if you want 20% of your portfolio to be in bonds and stocks are doing well and bonds are just hanging in, then that's what bonds do. They're shooting off cash all the time, but they're not really growing. So if stocks are growing, you may have to sell some of your stocks and buy bonds. And that kind of drives people nuts because they say, oh my gosh, the stocks are doing great. You want me to sell those and buy the things that's not doing great? And the answer is absolutely, because when things reverse, and they always do, and stocks have a tough environment, you're going to be glad you've got those bonds. And guess what? Now we get to sell some bonds and buy some stocks at much cheaper prices. And just make sure that you have enough bonds in the portfolio if you are distributing to have enough to distribute. So what I mean by that is if you're taking 4 to 5%, which we talked about in our previous podcast, let's just say you're taking 5% and you have 20% of your portfolio in bonds. Guess what that means? That means that you've got 4 years to draw only from bonds without having to touch stocks during a bad environment. That's probably not enough. We probably want something like 8 to 10 years. So we're probably looking at something like 40 to 50% of your portfolio should be in bonds so that you can distribute enough that you don't have to draw from stocks when they're down. If you get that set up, you're in a pretty good place.
And I understand bonds aren't the flashiest of investment vehicles, but they really keep your plan in place. They keep your plan drivable, as we always say. I think the real first step it's really to start simple, reviewing it as Ryan was saying, and really adjusting it to what your needs are. It's also important to consider different types of bonds, different types of bond funds with a professional, with a certified financial planner, or even doing your own research is always important.
Absolutely. You can't go wrong by talking to a professional. They're going to typically steer you in the right direction. Thanks so much for joining us on our podcast. If you enjoyed what you heard today, please go on and give us 5 stars. Make sure you're subscribing. Make sure that you get all the new content as it comes out. You want to stay on top of the latest information that we're putting out, especially when it comes to your retirement. If you're near or in retirement, you can't miss this information. A lot of great strategies, cutting edge tools, making sure that you don't make these mistakes that we're seeing people that walk into our office make all the time. And make sure you keep planning and stay intentional.
Thank you for listening to Retirement GPS, navigated by Zenergy. To explore today's topic further, visit our blog mile markers at Synergyretirement.com/blog, where we offer detailed strategies, examples, and downloadable tools to support your retirement journey. Follow us on LinkedIn, Instagram, and Facebook at Synergy Retirement Planning for weekly insights, checklists, and planning reminders. If you found this episode helpful, please subscribe, leave a 5-star review, and share it with someone planning for their future. Until next time, keep navigating toward a confident retirement. This podcast is for informational purposes only and is not intended as investment, legal, or tax advice. Listeners should consult their own financial, tax, and legal advisors before making any decisions. Synergy Retirement Planning is a registered investment advisor located in Red Bank, New Jersey.